The theme of this first panel is Trans-disciplinary Foundations of the Market. So in a sense, it's a continuation of some of the themes we were discussing in the previous session. We're going to explore the relationship between economic theories and models and the political, legal, social, technological, and commercial factors influencing the functioning of markets, to identify the scope for designing and regulating markets in a manner that promotes full employment and more equitable income distribution within the context of a market economy. And I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks and then turn it to the panelists, and I hope that we'll have about half of this session for open discussion of the issues of this panel and then anything else that's on your mind. And the first was just to reiterate or expand on a point I made earlier, and that is that when we look at the economy functions within a wider social context and is influenced by so many other factors that are considered externalities, but are really inseparable. You know, I think of it this way, that if you talk to a doctor, he'll talk to you about the circulatory system, the metabolic system, the digestive system, the lymphatic system, the nervous system, and everything. But if you go into the human body, that you find out that's a complete abstraction. There is no circulatory system independent of the respiratory system or the metabolic system there. These are conceptualizations, but they're all really integrated aspects of one organism. Sometimes in our abstraction, we really tend to deal with them or think of them as if they're independent or autonomous of one another. So economy is an integral part of the social organism. Another way of looking at these boundaries is to think that they are shifting. And one of the founders of our new economy group and the editor-in-chief of Cadmus Journal, Orio Giarini, has been writing for the last 30, 40 years about the shifting boundaries of economy. One of them that has come up very well in the discussions this morning, the minister brought it up and others also, is globalization, because so much of our economic conception was started at the time when the nation state was the unit of economy, and now we have to reconceptualize it at the global level. A second, of course, is looking, which he made a number of the speakers, maybe majority of the speakers focused on, is the fact that markets and political system are inextricably interrelated to each other, and that relates to the issue of power as well. A third, I don't know why they're coming out of order, but is obviously that the relationship that our previous question came up was the relationship between economy and ecology. And we now know, at least in future, that we can't talk economic theory as if ecology is an externality. Another one which we often, in economic discussions, tend to leave aside is the non-monetarized sector. If we're talking about the goal of economy is economic growth as measured in monetary terms, it's one thing. But the moment we talk about economy's purpose as maximizing human welfare, then we have to look at all of the activities in the society that contribute to human welfare. And then it becomes obvious that the boundaries between the monetarized and non-monetarized sector are constantly moving in both directions. And we have to look at the impact of that movement and not just look at one part of it. An obvious example would be when the participation of women in the workforce increases and we show higher employment in the economy. A mother who was taking care of the family and the home goes to work and hires somebody to come and clean the house and somebody else to take care of the children, well, we get a double boost to GDP, to monetary GDP. Whether we actually get an enhancement of human welfare for the mother or for the family or for the society is another question. So this is an important boundary to consider. And another one which Oreo Giarini focused on quite a bit is raising a question as we evolve more and more from an industrial to a service or a knowledge-based service society, the very conception of value and how we measure value and the time frame for the measurement of value changes. His point is that in industrial goods, you have a particular moment when goods are sold. That's no longer quite as true as it used to be. But when it comes to the delivery of services, you have a very long period from the creation of the infrastructure and the delivery of those services. Your costs may be mainly involved with building the hospital or building the educational system, and the benefits are delivered out over a much longer period of time. And of course, even in manufacturing today, R&D may be preceding by a decade or more the actual commercialization of a product, and liability for the consequences of it may go on for a decade or more in advance. So he raises the question that the very notion of value is now linked to utilization time, which was not a primary conception when industrial economics was developing. So these are just a few examples. And then the obvious one, that economy is not operating in a static field. It is, the whole society is evolving, and what are the implications of that to thinking about evolutionary or economic theory. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and let's hear from them briefly, and then let's open it up for more general discussion. So our panelist will be Tomas Bjorkman, who's already been introduced to you, and then I'll just introduce the other two. Dimitrios Kyriakou is Chief Economist of the European Commission's Institute for Prospective Technological Studies. He's a management consultant with the Commercial Bank of Greece. He's a member of our, both are members of our New Economic Theory Working Group, as is Carlos Alvarez Pereira, who's founder and president of Inaxis Foundation and Research Institute, and also an entrepreneur, a very entrepreneurial entrepreneur. I may say he can talk about that if he wants.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Garry, for inviting me and provoking me enough to participate in this colloquium. Actually, I'm not at all a person in academia. I used to be in a previous life. I was a lecturer and researcher in applied mathematics, but that was very, very long ago. I am an entrepreneur, and what I will do here is basically to add some provocations to the provocations which have already been expressed. But before that, I would like also to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here in Lisbon, which is not only a beautiful city, but a place which for many Spaniards, and me including, is very deep in our hearts. So, muito obrigado pela hospitalidade. So thank you for organizing this and for giving me the opportunity to provoke you some more. One of the sentences which I thought would be provocative, but actually I think it's more or less a summary of what we have been already discussing, is that the economy is not the economy. That has been said in many different ways by different people from the presenters and also from the audience. When I say the economy is not the economy, I'm saying that from many dimensions, many different points of view, from ontology, from epistemology, and from ethics, the economy is not what we use to understand as economy, or what the public debate uses to understand as economy.
it's quite different, as we have been already heard up to now, and there are a lot of reasons to continue in that direction. One, in my view, again, these are provocations, not academic statements. I'm not in academia. But one of the reasons to say the economy is not the economy is that typically, definitely in the public debate, but also in academic papers, I think, or in academic discussions, many times the concepts seem too simplistic. Definitely in the public debate, market capitalism and companies or corporations or enterprises are conceived as the same thing or different aspects of the same thing, and they are not at all. Markets are much older than capitalism, for instance. Much, much older. And does capitalism like markets? Not so sure, as you know, depending on the regulation, and I appreciated the presentation by Tomas Bjorkman, but depending on the regulation, efficient markets, you could speak about efficiency of markets in the sense that they kill profits. So of course capitalism in the strict sense of the purpose of accumulation of capital is not a very good friend of markets in that sense. And also companies are not necessarily capitalistic, and they do not have only the purpose of accumulating capital. There are also many other purposes, as any entrepreneur knows and suffers, because it's very tough many times to combine the other purposes of a company, of an enterprise, with this viability check of accumulating capital. Also, as is obvious, should I insist that values are not equal to prices? But we, in the public debate again, and in the managerial debate, many times we use the sense of value as an equivalent to accumulating wealth, to accumulating capital, to accumulating cash. But values are not prices. Prices are determined by many things, and among them I very much agree with the comment by Garry that we cannot talk about this seriously if we don't talk about power and the distribution of power. And prices are definitely not the same as costs. Of course, nobody pretends that they are the same, but the gap between prices and costs is dramatic. And is dramatic in the sense that the economy as it works today do not reflect a lot of costs, a lot of real costs. We still live in a physical world, and we have not been dematerialized yet. So we live in a physical world, and we have not been taking into account a lot of real costs. Not to talk about unpaid labor or low-paid labor, etc., etc. More on this, that the concepts are many times too simplistic. I have a problem with talking about market economy, because I think that economy is mainly not delivered by markets, which is another provocation, of course. But let's look at all the rich countries in the world. You will see that the public sector is roughly half the size of the official economy. So you have half of the economy which is not delivered by markets, but by public institutions. But if you look at the other half of the official economy, most of that is delivered internally in large organizations which do not apply the market paradigm internally. They are not buying and selling. Corporation is not buying and selling among departments and establishing internal markets among departments. They are trying to make people collaborate, not to compete inside. Not to say that, of course, there are a lot of unofficial economy. Most of our lives are not traded in transactions in markets. So, while free markets do not exist, we had enough about that. Of course, markets are what we understand as markets now, which is capitalistic markets, are not independent from the states. Not at all. It's not this dilemma of the state versus the market is a false dilemma. So it's a question of regulation of the market, but no markets exist without political authority. And of course, that has already been said, markets and companies and everything are always dynamic and far from equilibrium. So I will not insist on the implications of this for the mainstream economic theory. As I said, companies have multi-dimensional purposes. And one point I would like to raise is when we talk about companies, typically we are putting in the same box, in the same category, the smallest shop you can imagine on your street and a big multinational. Does it make any sense? Are they the same species? If you look at the orders of magnitude, there may be a gap of 6 or 7 orders of magnitude between them. So it's like using the same concepts for cells, from cells to elephants. Are they the same animal? So some provocations. Of course, another point which has already been mentioned is that real persons are much more complex than the Homo economicus, which may give an explanation for this paradox that economic progress measured by GDP per capita is no longer correlated since the 70s in the rich countries, since the 70s with genuine progress, measured in different ways, quantitatively and qualitatively. So, another good question, why does this happen? The economy seemingly has continued to grow since the 70s, but not the general welfare of people. As Tomas said, we have to get rid of this idea that the economy is a machine. No, the economy is not a machine, it's not separate from society, not at all. And it's much, the entanglement between economy and society is even much more complex than we can imagine. Not sure we can understand it, actually. And well, I will talk more about that in my presentation tomorrow, but one of the characteristics, of course, of this metaphor is that we understand that a machine has inputs, produces outputs, and it produces waste. And so, in a way, we are saying that the rest of the world is there to give inputs to the economy, to receive the outputs, and to absorb the waste. But also the fact that it is a very convenient metaphor for the people who are the elite, managing and designing and accumulating the power. I mean, if a machine definitely needs designers and managers. So I said entanglement between ontology, epistemology, and ethics. If we think a little bit about what the economy should be, that's an ethical and political, of course, statement. Maybe that we should consider that as a social scale system of systems to address human needs in harmony with nature, which is definitely not the case right now. But that brings us to different concepts which are typically not used. So this is not to say that economists have no future. It's exactly the contrary. There is a lot of work to do. And for them to work also with specialists from other disciplines, because so as a societal system, the economy is historical, evolutionary, contingent, dynamic, autopoietic, entangled with power and politics, as we said, depends so much about culture. It creates and destroys. It's based on decisions and human decisions. What does impact on human decisions? Everything. We don't know. We don't know how we take decisions. And that's a provocation, of course. How could we know if we really take conscious, not to say rational, but conscious decisions if most of our intelligence is unconscious? So, from the point of view of technicalities, we should listen. And again, I agree well, I don't agree with everything that Tomas said, but yes, of course, we were not able to use these concepts with the physics of 18th century, but now we are able to use the concept of complex network of networks to put at the very core of this issue the interactions between agents, to know that non-linearities, instabilities, emergent behaviors are standard outcomes, not accidents, but standard outcomes when you have a complex system. Uncertainty is intrinsic, and something which is even more important, that we should start forgetting about measurability, our obsession about measurability. As Robert Hoffman started to point out in his question, actually there are very few things which we are able to measure in a sound way. And in the end, we cannot measure value. We cannot measure value, especially not in monetary terms. So that's provocation. Oh, I skipped one, or I forgot to include one. So sorry, but so that's practical. But my last, so I thought I had included a slide which I've put in my presentation of tomorrow, is the complexity of society and therefore of economy looks like, I'm not saying it's the same, but looks like the complexity of life itself. And the point is that we don't understand life. So I stop here.
We will go on to a general discussion, but if there's anything specific for any question specific to Carlos, we can wait for the discussion about it later, but if you have a specific question from him, from what he said. If nobody else does, I have one for you, Carlos. Looking at the market as a complex system, what does complexity theory tell us about the natural tendency of a complex system to concentrate or distribute power?
Well, formulated that way, I'm afraid complexity theory says nothing. No, because complexity theory is also the observation of complex networks, and it is true that complex networks, that in many natural cases you find that networks are not homogeneous. The distribution of the nodes, which have the most connections, is not homogeneous. So that's called in the technicalities scale-free networks. Okay, but we can use those concepts. So up to a point, you could say, well, complexity theory says that typically power or connections in a network are concentrated in a non-even way. But that's a very weird conclusion to say from that yes, then it's natural that markets concentrate power. This is why I say, and Thomas may have something to say, this is why I say beware, the ontological, epistemological and ethical dimensions are not separate.
Yes, and I would just, if I may, underline that we can't separate the ontological from the ethical. And I would also only add that complexity theory by itself does not say anything, as you say, about the distribution of power. I would say that it all depends on what are the specific feedback loops in the system under consideration. With different feedback loops, you will have different ways of self-organizing and different distribution patterns of power. And those feedback loops in a social constructed complex system can be changed.
Then, okay, well, I'll save it for further discussion, so I don't, yes.
Well, I heard with great attention your communication. I would like to put you a simple question. I didn't understand well what is for you in your model of market, what is for you the concept of value? You said value is not price, but is value a market concept, or in your model is something different? What is for you the definition of value?
The definition of value is purely human. Call it moral, philosophical, cultural, or political. The definition of value is strictly human. So I don't have. Sorry, more on this tomorrow. So you will understand more about what I'm saying tomorrow when I will explain more about my perspective. I don't have a model for markets. I think that the economy is much larger than markets, which doesn't mean that we could not use markets. I think that markets are mechanisms which are at hand. If we forget about the myth of the market, these are mechanisms which are at hand to be used, but we have to be careful to understand for what purposes and not to mislead ourselves in doing that. And regarding value, I prefer to let you waiting for tomorrow.
As we are on a panel, could we have a bit of a discussion? I just want to comment there on the question of value. And if I could answer the question from my perspective what value is, I totally agree. Value is a human thing. There are no values per se out there in the universe. But what is important to me is that value is a multi-dimensional concept. So human values we got many dimensions when it comes to values. We value many different things, and they are not necessarily interchangeable. And one of the beauties with the market, but also of course a great limitation, is that in mathematical terms we have this huge multi-dimensional human value space that is so difficult to coordinate. And then the market is a projection of this multidimensional space into a one-dimensional space called economic price. And that is of course beautiful because that simplifies things a lot, but it is a very, very crude reduction of this space down to one dimension. And to tie this to my presentation, this reduction is done partly through the constitutive rules of the market. So we are a little bit responsible for the way that we are making this reduction into price. And one example is, of course, that we as humans might value nature. And that is typically a dimension of our human value space that is not correctly mapped into economic price.
May I insist?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be here tomorrow to hear your paper, of course, but for centuries I may say that the value was at the center of economic theory, and as we all know, around the value, different theories developed. We have Keynesian, neoclassical, classical, Marxian, and so on, different theories around the economic concept of value. If I may conclude from your both interventions, you don't different. May I understand that as a new theory of the value? I may say human values, not value, but human values that you want to introduce in economic concepts?
I would answer to that, work in progress. We don't have yet that theory. But so this is related to what I said, that actually we are analyzing we were making a theory about economics, which is social science, so which has the complexity of society, using the tools of, or some of the tools of classical mechanics, which is way too far. So physics, of course, has been our favorite science because it has produced so much results. But we are still using concepts of classical mechanics, which was, okay, two centuries ago. So maybe we can improve by using the concepts of contemporary physics, but actually I think it's not enough. Because coming back to your comment, yes, value is multidimensional. In most of the cases of real life, the problems we face are infinite dimensional. There are infinite dimensions. So of course, we cannot treat them with infinite dimensions. We have to try to reduce the number of dimensions. Many times reducing them to one is too much. You know the citation by Einstein, make it simple but not too simple. So reducing, in many cases, reducing from infinite dimensions to one is too much. You lose a lot of things. You lose a lot of richness in that process. So my feeling is that actually what we should start is trying to work with the tools of life sciences, of biology, which is much more complex not than contemporary physics, but definitely than classical mechanics, and there are still so much things we don't know about life. But there are tools which we could start to use to start working on economics. So, but that's a provocative statement again.
I want to just.
Okay, then I would like to, I know there are other questions too. I'd like to get our panelists in on this discussion.
I just wanted to say one more thing is on the multidimensional aspect of value, that it is interesting actually that we are now starting to see the introduction of multidimensional values in a very strange place, not where you would expect it to see it perhaps in the environmental discussion, but in the banking industry, that during my time as chairman of the banking group in Sweden, during those 10 years changed from money is money to every money comes with a label saying where was it earned, for what purpose, and this label follows through the system in an anti-money laundering thing that sort of keeps the money multidimensional. And of course we could use the same thing. It's a clumsy administration and we banks hate it, but if it has been possible to implement that rigorously in the banking industry, of course that could be applied to more areas.
I know there are other questions, but let's hear from Dimitrios, and then we will go back to the discussion. Winston, I see your hand.
I will switch gears entirely, so if the comment is on this, let's get this one in too, because my presentation it will be on...
It'll stimulate further.
So, Dimitrios Kyriakou, European Commission, what I will do, on the contrary to what has just been done, I will try to connect with the previous session. I work at the European Commission, so the first thing I would like to say was that I appreciated the last presentation in the previous session, and I would like to add to that much of what we see has to do, and the presenter indirectly suggested that, with the gradual eclipse of the importance of the Commission and the increasingly larger importance of the Council and of the intergovernmental process there. Second, there was an important discussion at the end of that previous session, and I would like to add something to this and link it with my presentation now. Regarding central banks, the contracts between national central banks, the European Central Bank, etc. The only way a larger supranational central bank can work is when it comes to existential type crisis, if the country that deals with an existential type crisis feels that it is treated by the new supranational central bank in ways that are similar to the way it would have been treated by its own central bank that it largely relinquished when moving to a common currency. That is the litmus test. And whether we will move to more integration or less integration, as some in the audience suggested, depends largely on this. Whether the European level institutions, when member states are faced with existential type threats, regardless of how large or small these states are, they feel that they are dealt with in a way that does not make them substantially more threatened than they would be otherwise. Connecting it now with my presentation. Why do we have this problem with the European Central Bank? And I think indirectly it was alluded to, but perhaps it needs pointing out. The European Central Bank, unlike the US Federal Reserve, and unlike most national central banks, has a unique mandate focusing on price stability. The US Federal Reserve has a two-legged mandate, second leg being employment. You can call it, looking towards boosting growth, employment. There must be, or there usually is, either explicitly or implicitly, a second leg to the mandate of central banks. In the case of the European Central Bank, it is exclusively price stability. And moreover, in practice, this has been translated into a sort of atavistic, that's my term, emphasis on inflation and fears of inflation that draw back to experience from the 20s up to the 70s. We can go into that, perhaps we will in my presentation tomorrow, which will be more practical. Today's will be more theoretical. I should add two important preambles. Number one, what I will say in no way reflects the opinion of the European Commission. I'm here on titre personnel, as they say in French. Number one. Number two, I don't know how the commercial bank reference got in there. That is an error. I'm not I cannot claim to be a consultant for any commercial bank in Greece or any other country. However, a part of my bio that may be useful, perhaps more so in what we will discuss tomorrow, is that for 2 years I was economic advisor in the Prime Minister's office in Greece, 2011, 2012, after the crisis erupted, so you cannot blame me for anything. And that was through 3 Greek Prime Ministers. So if you want to ask me about this, I'd be glad to respond. Now, going on to the more theoretically, or at least that's the way I perceived it, presentation or comments rather than presentation of today. And since we only have very few minutes, what I will do is I will give you 2 or 3 basic points I would like you to remember, even if you don't pay attention to anything else I may say after those 3 points. Number one, it is high time, in more ways than one, not just because of the context, the crisis and post-crisis undertow we are still fighting against, even because of theoretical developments in the last 30 years or so. It is high time that there is a strong challenge to what could be called neo-laissez-faire, I don't like the neoclassical term, neo-laissez-faire orthodoxy, or the Washington consensus. That's a very standard way of calling it. It emerged in the 80s, more or less. It is still in use, especially when it refers to policy advice and policy making. Number one. Number two, in providing or trying to pursue this challenge, we should pursue both of the avenues that are usually available. And very often I see people, very smart people, dedicated exclusively to either the one or the other. And I think both should be pursued. What are these 2 avenues? The first avenue, the one most often talked about, is the one that is external to the neo-laissez-faire Washington consensus mainstream economic literature. So it's a parallel exercise. You may call it evolutionary economics, you may call it what you will. It's almost a parallel universe. Very interesting work done there, but it's almost incompatible, a dialogue of the deaf, when you try to have the 2 sides talk across the aisle. Several eyes, actually, it's not just 2 sides, there's several different sides, different parallel views of this. It's worth pursuing, but it shouldn't be the only one. The other one that should be pursued is the work, very critical work, that has been done in the last several decades already within the mainstream paradigm. I can mention if I have time, I would mention a few such examples. So a two-pronged approach, if you will. The third point I would like to leave you with, before I go into the more theoretical stuff, is that it is very important that we take the context into account, the policy context in particular, for two reasons. First of all, because in a crisis and post-crisis, we're trying to imagine the crisis. The term post-crisis does not really reflect where we are. The image I usually use is we are fighting the undertow. The situation where you try to, you're in the ocean and you try to get to shore, you have to fight with the undertow. So that's where we are since 2008. To use the policy context for two reasons. Number one, because as we can see from history, paradigm shifts in economics as well as in other areas usually come about when the context is propitious, not just in theoretical terms, but also in the application side, in policy terms basically when it comes to economics. We knew, analysts had suggested already back in the 50s and 60s very stern criticisms against the Keynesian model. Until the 70s, the mid to late 70s, when it was hit, the Western world was hit by the 2008 crisis and the way the response did not really work. I was about to say work. It didn't really work. It was only at that time that those theoretical criticisms that had been levied for more than 20 years actually got to center stage and got the limelight. And it is since the 80s that we have this different paradigm. For more than 30 years now, I think it's high time that we give it a second look at the way the Keynesian paradigm, if you will, was given since the 70s. The second reason why looking at the policy context and taking into account is important is because even though the Washington consensus type policies are the ones that still carry the day, within large organizations like the Commission, for instance, there are alternative approaches that have an important policy backing too. For instance, an approach that colleagues of mine and myself work in is the so-called smart specialization approach to regional development. That has been embraced full-heartedly by the Director General for Regional Development. And if you look through it, and if you read it carefully, it is actually in stark contrast, in juxtaposition to the adjustment programs behind the very heavy mathematical models that the neo-laissez-faire, the Washington consensus, the mainstream model has presented itself and is still very popular. By way of example, in the utility functions that are used, and the promise of this approach is that welfare, social welfare, is maximized if you follow this approach. Altruism and envy don't exist. So, individuals, economic agents, are supposed to operate without any sign of envy or altruism. Why? Because if you allow for altruism and envy, it messes up the mathematics tremendously. Number one. Number two, that of course you would expect, and I guess most of us would expect. What I didn't expect was something that I had from my late advisor, Bill Branson, who told me that Muth was a very important economist in the early 60s, actually the father of rational expectations. So in a sense, not the sort of person you would expect to do the work that I'm about to mention now. Muth started toying around with building models in which envy and altruism would be allowed. And what he got, and I don't know if it was ever published, my advisor didn't know, he knew Muth, but he didn't know if that was ever got published. All goods become public goods. Now, when all goods become public goods, not only the mathematics is very complicated, the politics becomes very complicated. So ideologically speaking, it's something you have to be very careful playing with. Talking about ideologically, and the politics of things. A huge problem is that those theorems, the fundamental theorems of welfare calculus, and all the edifice heavily mathematicized, It is usually presented with the persuasion of a ton of equations. Was proved already since the 70s of being unstable in the sense of dynamic instability. And since the 80s and 90s, you have more and more theorems proven consolidating that. Actually, Arrow, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, said notoriously about that first theorem proved in the mid-70s that that was a theorem that should not have been proven. It was that devastating. Now, this is something that has been known in theoretical circles for 30, 40 years, but it hasn't percolated into the more practical side, the policy conclusions, the policy corollaries, if you will. I'll just mention one more thing, because I think it is important, and it has to do also with it's not theoretical, it has to do with the policy context. Much of the challenge that is facing the dominant model, the Washington consensus model, actually predates the 2008 crisis. It is clearly the crisis has changed, it's a game changer, and should be. But it began when productivity growth started faltering. Remember the theories and the hype about a new economy emerging in the 90s with the internet and all that? That bubble, basically we have had a series of bubbles since the early 80s of different sorts. The technology one in the 90s was one of them. But the hope or the hype, if you will, was that we have entered a new economy and productivity growth had entered a new plateau, a new growth path altogether. Now, since the early 2000s, and I'm closing here, we know that this was not the case, that the productivity growth we saw in the 90s was limited to ICT-related industries. And more importantly, since the early 2000s, we have productivity growth faltering in the Western world. So the real part of the economy is calling us to task. That there must be a more serious conversation about things like growth and equality, about where growth, innovation come from, and where do we devote resources in society. I'll stop here because there's no more time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Questions for Dimitrios or any other? Okay, Winston had a hand long ago, so I will honor him first, and then Robert. Very interesting.
Well, my general impression is that the panelists delivered an extraordinarily complex idea with regard to the role of values in human, social, and decision processes. In my own work, I've realized this, and clearly we need to find a way to simplify this and give it some practical connectivity. The starting point that I and others have used is human needs. And human needs can be translated into values, namely what people desire. And then the question is, what are these desired needs? And we have guidance from psychologists, Maslow, Laswell, and Dougal, and a whole range of others. But the fundamental idea is that you can basically distill I've added 9 values, and the central issue is to not only identify the values, but to connect them with an institutional framework that give them a social process of relevance. So we know that everyone wants a piece of power, and the question is, how do you express your desire? Well, you express it through the institutions of politics, that is to say, political parties, pressure groups, and what have you. And I can go through all of the other values, question of respect, that's really a matter of social class distinctions, and antipathy toward the notion of inequality and so on. Again, the issue of affect, which means the the reproduction of positive sentiment in as many of the human institutions as we can possibly influence. Health and well-being, education, respect, enlightenment, and so on. So that is a model that is drawn in part from the insights generated by the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is to say, every one of these values or needs is reflected in the document itself and reflected in subsequent documents developed into what we call the International Bill of Rights. In other words, we don't have to float around in the air. There is some guidance to give some specificity to the value discourse. The central question is, what are the institutions that are specialized to the particular values, and how do they work? Their level of efficacy becomes important.
Winston, let's give some other people to a chance.
So, what I fear is, if we make the discourse so complicated, who's going to follow us, you know? So we have to find a way to simplify, provide institutional frameworks, and have a much more explicit sense of the specific values that people want and people need. Thank you.
Thank you. We had two more hands. I think, Vasilin, you've been a long time, you wanted something, so go ahead.
Yeah, it was inspired by the previous speakers, but also by your comment now, because as far as I remember, the term value etymologically is derived from the word importance. And if value is what is important, then it's pretty obvious that different things are important to different people for different reasons at different points of time. And so value probably is inherently multidimensional. And that makes the projection which you mentioned into a one-dimensional thing even more than rude. I just imagined that someone asked me, how was the wine for lunch? And I said about 12 centimeters. That is not only a rude assumption, it is nonsensical. It doesn't tell anything about the question, because a multi-dimensional quality impression is reduced to the level how much wine was in the carafe that we got. So in that sense, I think we have to be careful that we're not only rude but not even completely nonsensical. I'm not afraid about the complexity, because my experience is that if you want to have a creative solution, you are brainstorming and you're getting more and more confused. And we are just working towards a higher level of confusion. And what we should aim for is the optimal level of confusion, because that is from which new insights and new concepts emerge. And the only risk is to confuse the optimal and the maximum level of confusion. Something economists tend to do frequently. So,
is there a question?
Yes, yeah, that was the stimulated stuff. My main question was, I understand that we live in a complex, evolving system, which makes it even more difficult, the dynamics of evolution, and it's a panacea of different nest systems, right? But all the discussions we had beforehand was about bringing about change. So that means it was a call to manage this complex system in a way that certain desired results come out of it. And so the question is about complexity management and how you do that. And I wanted to use that's an open question for the discussion, I think. But I wanted to use the opportunity that we have two entrepreneurs over there to ask, what I observe in the management schools is the financialization of management techniques. So the board member needs only to know financial figures, not even which products exactly the firm is producing, and the management on the top level happens according to exclusively financial criteria. Big hotel chains are spinning off the individual hotels and managing their assets under financial criteria. Is that an attempt to overcome the complexity by having that simplification And are there other ways in the business world how to develop tools which can handle the management tasks for this complex panachy in which the business is acting?
Thank you. Let's take another. Robert, maybe yours the last comment, and then we open it for final comments of the panel. Robert, you want to?
Sure. Things I wanted to add to the value discussion. I would hope that the new economic theory that might emerge from our discussions explicitly not include a theory of value. I agree with speakers past that value is strictly a subjective item, and it's also an emergent phenomena. Ethics and values are part of rule systems that emerge as knowledge and know-how increase the complexity and the order in the systems in which we're involved. And so the idea that there can be universal and timeless values objectively measured, I think should be rejected. So that's one point. Second point was a suggestion, almost derogative, that all goods can become public goods. And that struck me as being not a bad idea at all. If on the other extreme all goods were to become private goods, that strikes me as being by far the worst extreme. Given the finiteness of our planet and its abilities to sustain us, it's not a bad idea in my mind to regard all goods as belonging to the common. In some sense belonging to everybody, and the benefits that accrue from the commons should be fairly divided among, in some sense, all of us, all citizens. A final little story about central banks, I guess. I come from Canada. The Canadian Central Bank was created by an act of Parliament, an act of government. It was created explicitly in the Act that it was mandated to provide interest-free loans to all levels of government. It failed to do this, and in fact has given the power to create credit to the commercial banks. Now the commercial banks can create money, can create credit, and they do so only under the conditions, of course, that the loan will be repaid and repaid with interest. What this transfer of the authority has made it extraordinarily difficult to finance public goods. So although there's a lot of liquidity sitting around waiting to find a positive financial return, there are many public goods that are desperately, and infrastructure that desperately require investment. The interesting side note to this story is that a small group of citizens have initiated legal action against the Bank of Canada, alleging a conspiracy between the international banks and the Canadian Central Bank, that they have illegally transferred the authority to create credit to the commercial banks, and this is now playing out in the courts. As for what this implies to me, is that central banks should indeed not be independent if one of their jobs is to allocate credit. By and large, it is the function of government that has responsibility for stewardship and creation of the public good. And to remove that and allocate it to an independent central bank strikes me as being a huge error.
Okay, last comments by panelists to anything. Yes, start with you.
Well, to a number of comments which have been made. First about complexity and what I understand by complexity, and although although if you meet two researchers in complex systems, they will probably have two different definitions of complexity. But there is still a commonality which has nothing to do with things complicated. Let's make a difference. Complexity is specifically about the fact that in all interesting systems, there are a very high number of interactions between autonomous agents. So there are autonomous parts, whether they be cells or humans or whatever, which are interacting in non-trivial ways. So you cannot understand the behavior of the system using reductionist tools, reductionist concepts. The system is more than the parts. And it's not a question of do we find complexity a bad or good thing. We are here thanks to complexity. I mean, life has emerged. It started very, very, very long ago, and we are here thanks to complexity acting as a mechanism over millions of years, and thanks to the fact that there are flows of energy coming to the Earth, which made possible that dissipative structures emerged out of equilibrium. Structures emerged out of this, and in the end we don't know yet. But for the moment, us as a dissipative structure. So complexity is a fact of life. Dot period. So we better should accept that and start building out of that. Because you mentioned how do we deal with complexity as managers? Well, the first thing is to accept it, to accept that complexity. And I mean, I think my first rule as a manager is that the human factor is by far the most important factor in any organization, including startups, companies, or whatever. And that's accepting the complexity of human groups. And then you can start building on that. And then maybe you can have something emerging, something new, like institutions emerging out of that. My second comment, so yes, I agree, management should not be reduced to finance. When you reduce management to finance, the company dies, basically. So, but that's, there are a lot of literature on this, and in my personal experience, it's definitely like that. And just coming to the point of values, I completely agree with Bob. We shouldn't pursue the goal of making a declaration of universal values, but that we cannot prevent from analyzing and self-analyzing. How do we express, many times unknowingly, how do we express the values, our values, what we think is important, in the things we do, in the mechanism we create, in the political decisions we take, and also in the declarations. And tomorrow I will put an example of in a universal declaration which is generally accepted as a good starting point, which is the definition of sustainability. In that declaration there are blind spots. There are blind spots which point to the fact that we were declaring that some things were important and other things were not important. In that declaration, the sustainability declaration adopted by the United Nations. So we have blind spots which make that we express our values in what we do, in the way we write on them, but also in the way we behave, of course. And we cannot prevent a reflection on that. But the goal is definitely not, and I will not take it easy. I will not propose tomorrow a new definition of what is value. I will just suggest some provocations on what I think could be hints for going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Dimitrios.
There were a couple of things that were more directly, I guess, addressed to me, so I'll start with those. They mentioned the public goods issue. I don't disagree with you. What I said was that to the person doing that research, Move was his name, that probably came as a shock. because the work that made him famous was the work on rational expectations, which was the most important building block, most likely, since then, to fight off government intervention. So it would be like Marx in his research discovering that, surprise, surprise, property and protecting property rights may be very good. Something of that sort. Second, central banks. Independence of central banks, it used to be a hot issue. I'm afraid not anymore. The last one to relinquish its independence was actually the first central bank ever created, the British, or the English rather, central bank. And I think it only did it in the 90s. It was created in 1687. It took it 3 centuries to relinquish independence. The rationale behind all of these losses of independence is inflation fighting. That you cannot commit to fighting inflation if your central bank is part of the state, or has to answer to the government. It is a very powerful argument. On the other hand, I alluded to this in my representation, inflation is not our problem. Inflation was a problem up until the 70s. It is not anymore. Why? It is no accident that it is not a problem. First of all, we have evidence it is not, because the US has been using extreme quantitative easing measures since 2007, and inflation has not picked up. Europe is doing the same thing with a long delay. Finally, in the last 10 months or so, 12 months or so, inflation is not picking up. So, first of all, there is empirical evidence that it's not a big issue anymore. There is a reason for this, not accidental. Actually, there are 2 reasons for this. Unlike the 70s, and you don't hear anybody talking about this. I mean, I'm talking about, you hear academics, but not top policymakers. And that, by the way, has to do, and I'm not going to go into details, with the profiles of those policymakers in high positions of power in Europe, especially in the European Central Bank, that come from very powerful countries, especially Germany. If you see their profiles, academic profiles, and you compare them with their Spanish, Italian, Greek counterparts, it's like night and day. But anyway, I won't go further into this. We don't have unions having the power that they had until the 70s. That's the number 1 reason why you don't see the inflation picking up. Second reason, even more important, even if a producer would like to put up his or her prices, the influx of goods from Asia, China, but not only China, would immediately undercut him. So these 2 elements are there, they weren't there in the past, and make inflation the concern, the inflation mongering, atavistic fear, especially in the underutilization of resources period that we find ourselves in now. Very briefly on the psychology, somebody mentioned psychology. I didn't have time to go into this, but a very important part of the rethinking of the way we understand about economics has to do with preferences and preference formation. The standard views assume preferences are fixed. It is extremely unrealistic, but it is, thank you, it is extremely unrealistic. Why is it there? First of all, it makes the math much easier. Very often, to all these questions that one may have, so why do they insist keeping those assumptions in? Very often, the response is like the Oppenheimer response. Oppenheimer, the famous physicist, Manhattan Project manager, notoriously said when he was asked whether he realized what was happening, what they were creating, nuclear bomb and all that, but they still went ahead. His final defense was, yeah, I know, we realized it, but it was so sweet technically. Technically, mathematically, it was so sweet. So very similar response you get in economics too about these things. Preference formation needs to be seen, adaptive preferences is the way to go. And I don't know how, it's complicated, but it clearly has to do with psychology, sociology, the way anthropologically even preferences are formed and develop over time. And finally, there is a way you guys have been, and I was just following the debate in the first few minutes of the session, you were discussing values and all that, and it was fascinating. The dimension that perhaps you weren't emphasizing as much, or the direction rather, is the opposite direction. Not only do these ethical or ethics-related concerns influence economics, it's also the other way around. And it is by construction. That most people miss that. It's not accidental. It's, well, you see wealthy people behaving this way, you want to be wealthy too, so you start adapting your ethics to them. It's not only that, it's not accidental or incidental sort of aftermath. It is by construction because the way the model, the Western consensus model was built, is built on Milton Friedman's very explicit analysis in the 50s of how economics should be both normative and positive, which means that it should tell you how you should run your life, your business as an economic agent, how you should take economic decisions, and at the same time, it should be able to describe, the positive part, how this actually happens in the real world. Right, so happens, we know from experimentation as well as observation, people do not behave as pure rational economic agents, as this heroic rationality assumption as rational robots. They don't behave like that. So the only way that economics can be both normative and positive, as Friedman wanted it, is if it becomes positive through being normative. In other words, because it imposes, or rather, it induces a new sort of economic, a new sort of human agent that begins to behave the way the theory says it does, and he does, and he should.
Thank you. Last comment from Tomas?
Yeah. I just want to underline what you just said there, Dimitrios. I think that was a very, very insightful comment there about how our personal inner lives and how our social systems, how these two systems are so interconnected and constantly co-evolving, both within generations and over generations. Very important. Just two final comments. One comment there, again, on the value discussion. I just want to say that we shouldn't forget that we are doing value. We are making value decisions and value judgments all the time when we, as legislators, are creating the market. Should we be able to patent non-fertile seeds? Should somebody? That is a bad invention. I mean, technically bad invention. Should that still be protected by patents? That is a value decision. And it's also a value decision to decide what of all the all the costs that an operation causes should actually have financial implications on the profit and loss sheet. So we are making those decisions all the time, and we shouldn't be hiding that fact. And then my last comment is on the question there on management and the financial reporting. And I totally agree with you, Carlos, that those that are looking at managing companies purely through the financial data, they are at a dead end. And I think the most striking example I can have as an illustration of that is that 20 years ago, the brightest students from the Stockholm School of Economics, for example, could be attracted to a company by a very good salary and a bonus. You could, by just sort of taking a financial decision, we pay the best, we pay the most, and we get the best. That today, with the new generation, is just not possible. Those that come out at the top of the class at the Stockholm School of Economics, they are asking for meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose. And those managers who cannot understand how to manage meaning and purpose within a company, they will lose out in the race to attract the best talent. So if you're only looking at the financial numbers, they can never capture the meaning and purpose of your operation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all the panelists, Carlos, Dimitrios, Tomas, and all of the group here for a very active discussion. I think we have a lot to talk about in the next 2 days.